Dear Mom, I'm finally writing the letter I kept postponing, the one that lived in the back of my throat like a swallowed pin. People who only see headlines say you left, you rose, you won, but they don't know the daily math behind those verbs. How many breaths you spent pretending you were calm, how many nights you counted tiny risks like coins, how often you had to choose between peace and pick truth even when it cost you friends. I want to record the version I witnessed, the version that smelled like detergent and burnt garlic and the cheap ink of school notices, the version where courage didn't roar and pose, it simply showed up again the next morning. We looked like a family designed for admiration. Father's title made strangers nod before he even opened his mouth. He could stand on a university stage and make ignorance sound like a moral failure. You, with your doctorate in literature, could turn a line of poetry into a lantern and walk people through it. Our living room shelves held books the way other homes hold trophies. The neighbors assumed intelligence lived in our walls. And yet inside those walls, love felt conditional, like a scholarship you could lose. Vivian fit Father's fantasy perfectly. She answered questions quickly, argued neatly, won competitions, and learned early that praise is a currency that buys protection. I don't blame her for enjoying it. Children drink whatever warmth they're offered. But the warmth around her became a spotlight that made everything else look darker. When teachers compared us, Father's smile hardened. When relatives joked that I was slow, he didn't defend me. He absorbed the joke like proof. The house became a lab, and I became the specimen nobody wanted to claim. You tried to keep the balance by making our evenings normal. You asked me about school, warmed soup, corrected my homework without scolding. I clung to silly songs and simple routines, because routines don't judge you. When I was little, I loved a bright children's show with a ridiculous chorus, and I repeated it whenever the room felt tense, as if nonsense could soften adults. Sometimes it did. Sometimes you laughed despite yourself. Those small laughs were stitches holding the fabric together long after the cloth wanted to tear. The first time I realized Father had decided on a story about me, I didn't learn it from an insult. I learned it from secrecy. He began taking calls in the hallway, lowering his voice, stepping outside like a man arranging a business deal. He drove me to clinics without telling you, as if my mind were a defect he needed to confirm before returning the product. A professional smiled at me, asked gentle questions, and said I was healthy. Father frowned and asked for another test. When a second assessment also came back normal, he accused the testers of being careless. He spent money on expensive consultations and even on charlatans. And each time he was cheated, he looked at me as if I had embarrassed him personally. When you discovered what he was doing, you didn't cry quietly. You confronted him like a scholar confronting a plagiarist. You asked how a man who preached logic could be so ruled by gossip. You asked why his pride mattered more than his child. In one sharp moment you suggested, with brutal fairness, that if he loved tests so much, perhaps he should be tested too. He stormed off to fight the people who had joked, only to learn the joke was nothing but air. But by then air had already filled the rooms of his department, because reputations spread faster than corrections. That was when his cruelty changed shape. Before, he was merely cold. After, he became strategic. He didn't say, "I want to abandon you," because saying it would have made him the villain. Instead, he started arranging scenes where my disappearance could look accidental or deserved. I did not have the vocabulary for it then, but I recognize it now. He tried to erase evidence that didn't match his narrative. The first attempt came wrapped in a holiday. On Children's Day, he acted cheerful, bought cheap snacks, and drove me far from home to a tired amusement park where the paint peeled and the laughter sounded forced. He pointed to a bench and said he needed to handle something. I waited. An hour passed, then another. I watched families come and go, watched shadows lengthen, watched my own hands grow sticky around a plastic bottle. I realized I had been left, but I also realized something else. I could make his plan fail by staying visible. I borrowed a stranger's phone, called you, and told you exactly where I was, the way a soldier reports coordinates. You arrived like a storm with a mother's face. Your hair had come loose, your breathing was torn, your eyes were wild with the kind of fear that becomes anger. You grabbed me and checked my arms and my head as if you could undo the hours by inspecting me. When Father returned and tried to blame me for wandering, you didn't argue in circles. You demanded proof, demanded the call record, demanded the truth in front of witnesses. His voice shrank. That night the marriage did not end in one clean break, but the fracture became permanent. The second attempt happened in the countryside during a family gathering, when everyone's smiles were stiff and tradition sat at the table like an extra guest. You were exhausted, and, for once, not fully guarded. Father used that moment. He drove me into emptiness, told me to step out for fresh air, then accelerated away. I remember the sound of tires on gravel and how quickly taillights become tiny stars. Rage arrived before despair. I threw stones at the retreating car until my arm burned, not because stones could stop a vehicle, but because I needed the world to register my refusal. I walked. The details are still sharp. The taste of dust, the ache behind my eyes, the way strangers' faces looked dangerous until they offered water. I slept in short, frightened segments, the kind of sleep that keeps one ear awake. When I finally found you again, you held me so tightly I could barely breathe, and I understood that love is sometimes physical force, the kind that prevents a person from drifting away. Father hid behind relatives and demanded denial. People called me dramatic, called me liar, called me trouble. You started to reach for the police. And that was the moment the clan pulled out its favorite weapon, the future of the valuable child. They said Vivian would suffer if Father were punished. They said her opportunities would collapse. Vivian cried and begged you to stop, not because she cared about me, but because she had learned to treat Father's status as her oxygen tank. Father pointed at me and implied I was disposable. I watched the adults bargain with my safety, like it was a minor expense, and I learned a brutal lesson. Some people call cruelty practicality when they want to sleep at night. You chose the war you could win. You did not file the report, but you filed for divorce. And then you fought for custody and lost Vivian anyway, because the clan spoke about genetics as if it were property law. They kept her like a prize and let me go like a defect. And Vivian sealed her choice with words that cut worse than any slap. She said she would not live with a stupid little sister. You didn't collapse. You cooked. You fed. You packed. You moved us to another city and began again with a kind of discipline that made strangers assume you were unbreakable. In the new place, you had no relatives guarding your silence, but you had less money and fewer allies. Father still demanded payments for Vivian's endless programs, and you paid what the agreement required, not because he deserved it, but because your integrity refused to let him paint you as the irresponsible one. You rebuilt your days from practical blocks, a better school, a smaller apartment, a routine that kept my nervous system from exploding. You found a tutor who understood that shaming a child doesn't create intelligence, it creates panic. My grades rose not into brilliance, but into stability, and stability felt like a miracle. Bullying followed me like a shadow, because labels travel. Kids sensed weakness the way dogs sense fear. I learned to fight, not for sport, but for oxygen. At one point I became the boss of a small tribe of outcasts, and we wore silly temporary tattoos and shared stickers like they were uniforms. It was childish, but it was also an early experiment in solidarity. If you stand alone, you get targeted. If you stand together, you become a weather system. You did the adult version of solidarity. You marched into the school office with documents and a calm voice that carried steel underneath. You reported, escalated, persisted. Teachers who had assumed you were a powerless single mother discovered you had the patience and the vocabulary to outlast them. I watched you turn anger into procedure, and procedure into protection. That was when I began to suspect that your doctorate was not just a credential. It was training in how to argue with institutions. Then you started your company. People expected you to shrink because you were a divorced woman with a child who didn't look impressive on paper. Instead, you expanded. You partnered with a sharp-eyed businessman everyone called Quinn, and together you built something that moved faster than gossip. Father mocked you, asking how a literature person could understand markets. But you understood what he didn't. Markets are stories, and you had spent years reading stories people refused to admit they were telling. The business grew. Your posture changed. Your laughter returned in public. You stopped apologizing for taking up space. Father, meanwhile, turned Vivian into a project. He stacked her schedule with competitions, elite courses, and even absurd heritage lessons that sounded impressive in conversation. He loved the idea of being the father of a prodigy more than he loved being a father. Vivian learned to perform excellence until performance ate her sleep. Every success raised the bar and tightened the cage. From a distance, she looked perfect. Up close, she sounded exhausted. Years later, on the day of Vivian's college entrance exam, the truth that had been simmering finally boiled over. She called you, voice shaking, saying Father had been arrested for hitting a student. A struggling kid had failed a test, and Father, unable to tolerate imperfection, had crossed the line into violence. Titles did not protect him from handcuffs. You flew back because that is what you do. You run toward crises even when the crisis is someone else's fault. Vivian's world cracked. She blamed everyone except the person who built the crack, because blaming father would have meant admitting her entire identity was built on sand. I had my own dream by then, one you never mocked even when others did. I wanted to enter a military academy. I wanted a life where strength was not just a rumor, where I could protect people instead of constantly negotiating to be protected. I trained, I studied, I passed the written exams, and for once I felt the future opening like a gate. Then bureaucracy tried to shut it with one careless label. The medical recheck said I had severe flat feet and was disqualified. I stared at the paper as if it were a joke written by someone who hated me. You cried in a way you rarely allowed yourself to, not because a school was rejected, but because you recognized the old pattern, the world deciding I was defective without looking closely. Then you wiped your face and turned into the version of you that terrifies unfair systems. You demanded a re-examination, collected evidence, cross-checked records, and proved the report had been mixed up. When the corrected result arrived, you didn't celebrate quietly. You called your staff, your friends, anyone who had ever doubted us, and you laughed like someone taking back stolen time. You held a banquet to mark it, inviting people not to show off wealth but to create witnesses. That night, Father and Vivian appeared, as if unable to resist a stage. Vivian smiled sweetly and tried to cut me with disguised contempt, saying my acceptance was a miracle, for someone like me. Father bragged about tech connections he didn't truly have, and then he tried to shrink me again by implying that service was a low-class choice. You listened. And then you did the thing I will remember forever. You took the microphone. You didn't scream. You exposed. You described, in plain language, what intelligence means without character. Nothing. You pointed out how Father's so-called brilliance didn't help him keep a key, keep a promise, keep a child safe. You named his obsession with IQ as superstition wearing a suit. You praised me not for being exceptional, but for being steady, warm, resilient, and willing to serve. The room shifted. Some people laughed at first because they didn't know how to react. Then they fell silent because truth makes a different kind of sound. Father tried to interrupt, but public attention is a cage. Once you trap someone inside it, they can't escape without looking guilty. He fled anyway. After that, the trajectories separated. You kept building a life that did not require permission. Father's reputation, already brittle, finally snapped under the weight of his own actions. Vivian's perfection became unbearable, and the mind that had been trained to chase approval began to turn against itself. You helped where you could, but you did not surrender the life you had fought for, because you understood that saving someone does not mean letting them drown you. I grew into my own uniform. I learned to wake before sunrise without resentment, to follow orders without losing my conscience, to lead without imitating the cruelty I had seen. Sometimes, in training, when my lungs burned, I thought of you at your desk after midnight, still answering messages, still calculating payroll, still refusing to let fear steer. I realized we shared the same skill even though our worlds were different, the ability to keep going while the heart is tired. So this is my letter, Mom. A record, a thank you, and a promise. You refused to let my father's story define me. You refused to let the village and the colleagues and the relatives label me as defective and call it destiny. You taught me that ordinary can be a weapon, because ordinary people can outlast dramatic ones. You taught me that the best revenge is a life that cannot be controlled by the people who tried to discard you. If anyone asks why you became successful after the divorce, they can keep their superstitions about luck and blocking. The real reason is simpler. You stopped wasting your strength on a man who measured love like a score, and you spent it on building a world where your child could breathe. Love, your daughter. I want to tell you about the small, embarrassing things too, because those are the gears that turn a life, like the time a teacher assumed you had barely finished middle school because of my theatrical excuse, and you smiled politely while your doctorate sat invisible in your bag. Or the time you pretended not to be hurt when Vivian refused your calls, then cooked an excessive meal anyway, as if feeding me could feed the empty chair too. Or the way you learned to translate corporate jargon into plain decisions. In meetings, you listened like a novelist reading subtext. Then you asked one question that made the room reconsider its assumptions. People called it business instinct, but I knew it was the same skill that helped you survive marriage. You had trained yourself to read what people meant, not just what they said. I remember you teaching me, without lectures, that dignity can be practiced. You didn't scold me for not being brilliant. You showed me how to be reliable. You made me pack my own bag, set my own alarms, clean up after myself, and apologize when I was wrong. You said competence is a kind of freedom because it reduces the number of doors other people can lock. There was also the strange comedy of Father's helplessness. The man who lectured about complex theories could not assemble a simple piece of furniture without swearing. He could debate ethics in public and then forget to pay a basic bill. In hindsight, it makes sense. It is easy to look superior when your audience cannot check your daily life. Even my childhood rebellion had a logic you eventually recognized. When I formed my little alliance at school, I wasn't trying to become a villain. I was trying to stop being hunted. You explained later that institutions often move slowly, so people invent temporary systems to protect themselves. You didn't praise the fighting, but you praised the courage behind refusing to be erased. Sometimes I think about Vivian with a tenderness that surprises me. She was not born cruel. She was trained. Every compliment she received came with an unspoken invoice. Stay exceptional, or lose love. By the time she was old enough to question it, the cage had become her identity. I do not excuse her words, but I understand the fear that fed them. I also remember the exact moment your business started to feel inevitable. You came home one night after a client meeting, took off your shoes, and instead of sighing, you smiled. It wasn't a loud smile. It was the smile of someone who has located the exit in a building that used to feel like a trap. Quinn used to joke about fortune and blocking, as if life were a game of invisible forces. You rolled your eyes and said the only force you trusted was effort plus timing. But you still listened to his jokes, because you understood that humor is sometimes a way people confess what they cannot prove. In any case, once Father's calls stopped poisoning your mornings, you worked with a clarity that felt like sunlight. When the military academy problem happened, I saw how you respond to injustice. You refused to accept it as a final state. You treated the wrong diagnosis like a faulty contract. You gathered documents, asked for the chain of custody, demanded accountability, and did not accept vague promises. That persistence, more than any speech, is what I inherited. At the banquet, when you held the microphone, I saw the difference between cruelty and truth. Cruelty punches down for pleasure. Truth speaks because silence would be collaboration. You did not humiliate Father to entertain yourself. You corrected the record, so the room could stop rewarding a lie. Afterward, some relatives tried to call you too harsh. You answered with the calm line you always use when people confuse politeness with morality. You said that protecting the image of a violent man is not kindness. You said people who love peace should stop asking victims to buy it. In my own career, I have met men like Father, polished on stage, fragile off stage, hungry for applause, furious at evidence. I can spot them early because I grew up studying one. When such men test my boundaries, I do not argue. I document. I persist. And I keep my aim steady. If this letter finds you on a quiet afternoon between meetings, I hope you read it and let yourself rest for a full 10 minutes without planning the next task. I hope you remember that your worth was never a function of marriage, and my worth was never a function of IQ. We are not math problems. We are people who survived a poor equation and built a better one. One day, if I have children, I will teach them that family is not automatically a safe place. It becomes safe through choices. I will teach them that brilliance without compassion is just a sharper knife. I will teach them that the person who keeps showing up is often the real hero, even if nobody builds a statue. I keep replaying the day you discovered the secret testing, because it taught me that betrayal can arrive wearing concern. Father framed it as care. But he never asked how I felt. He asked what my score was. When you confronted him, you didn't debate his ego. You challenged his evidence. And that was the first time I saw you treat a marriage like an argument that must follow rules or be dismissed. After the first abandonment attempt, you started collecting details the way prosecutors collect exhibits. You wrote down dates, locations, small contradictions in his stories, and you did it quietly, because you already understood that loud anger gives a liar time to rearrange the room. I learned from that silence that strategy is not coldness, it is protection for the truth. When the second attempt happened, the countryside air smelled of wet soil and old cooking oil, and I remember feeling strangely calm after the car vanished, as if my body refused to waste energy on shock. I walked with a child's logic. Keep moving, keep asking, do not sit down in the dark. The bruises on my feet healed, but the knowledge stayed. An adult can choose to be dangerous, and a child can still choose to survive. The relatives' bargaining disgusted me most because it sounded so reasonable to them. They spoke of Vivian's future as if it were a public project, and my safety as if it were a private inconvenience. You listened, jaw set, then redirected the fight to the divorce, because you refused to keep negotiating inside a house that treated children as collateral. Moving cities felt like ripping a plant out of hard soil. You left behind familiar streets, familiar markets, and whatever sympathy you still had in the old neighborhood, and you carried only what mattered: documents, a few clothes, and your refusal to surrender. In the new apartment, our furniture was mismatched, but the air felt lighter, as if the walls were not waiting for someone's approval. You never pretended I was a genius. Instead, you treated me like a person who could be trained. You taught me to keep a schedule, to pack my bag the night before, to review mistakes instead of hiding them. When my mind wandered, you didn't call me stupid. You asked what distracted me, and then you adjusted the plan like a mechanic adjusting an engine. That tutor you hired saved me from the worst kind of classroom cruelty, the sigh that says a child is beyond help. She spoke slowly, explained patiently, and celebrated small improvements as if they were legitimate wins. The first time I brought home a passing score that wasn't embarrassing, you didn't throw a party. You cooked my favorite dish and let me eat in peace, and peace tasted better than applause. The bullying was never about my grades. It was about the rumor that I was defective. Children copy adult cruelty with disturbing accuracy, and I became their practice target. When I fought back, the teachers scolded the violence but ignored the provocation, and that hypocrisy made my anger sharpen into something organized. You didn't romanticize my fights, but you understood why I refused to be a quiet victim. I still laugh remembering how my little crew invented rules. No one eats alone. No one walks to the restroom alone. No one gets cornered after school. We were ridiculous, but we were also learning governance. Later, when I read about social systems in textbooks, I recognized the same patterns. People create alliances because isolation makes you easy to harm. Your business years felt like watching you step onto a larger stage without letting the spotlight blind you. You learned contracts, staffing, supply chains, and risk the way others learn recipes, and you did not rely on charm alone. Quinn liked to talk about fate, but you trusted spreadsheets and timing. You treated luck as something you can invite by being ready when the door opens. I watched you handle investors who tried to flatter you, and competitors who tried to bait you. You nodded, listened, asked for numbers, and refused to be rushed. Men who expected you to be either timid or dramatic never quite found the button that controlled you. Your calm was not softness. It was a refusal to let other people choreograph your reactions. Father kept trying to reinsert himself as a voice of authority, especially when Vivian's schedule became his bragging material. He talked about her accomplishments as if they were his own publications, and he spoke about me like an unfinished draft he could discard. I learned to hear the difference between confidence and insecurity, because his certainty always needed an audience to survive. Vivian's calls, rare as they were, taught me another truth. Praise can be a drug. She sounded exhausted, hungry for permission to rest, but terrified that resting would erase her value. I used to envy her status. Later, I envied her less and pitied her more, because the cage around her mind was built out of compliments and threats. The day she called about Father's arrest, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. Vindication because consequences had finally arrived, and sadness because consequences don't rewrite the past. You boarded a plane with the expression you wear when you choose responsibility over comfort, and I realized you were still cleaning messes you did not create. While you dealt with that chaos, I was training for my own gate. The military academy appealed to me because it made the rules explicit. Either you pass the standard or you don't. I loved the bluntness of it, perhaps because my childhood was full of invisible standards applied without explanation. Then came the medical mix-up, and it felt like the universe was trying to recycle the same insult with a new stamp. The paper declared my feet unfit, as if one trait could erase years of effort. You reacted the way you always do when a system lies. You demanded a recheck. You asked for the chain of documentation, and you refused to leave until someone admitted the error. That fight was not only for my admission, it was for the principle that labels must be earned, not assigned. When the corrected result arrived, I saw relief flood your face, like rain on dry earth. You didn't claim the victory as proof of your superiority. You simply enjoyed it as fairness restored, which may be the rarest pleasure in any bureaucracy. At the celebration banquet, you turned my acceptance into a public record, so nobody could later pretend it didn't happen. Father walked in hungry for attention. Vivian walked in armored with superiority. And the room tightened the way a room tightens before a storm. I watched you measure the moment, and then you took the microphone with the same precision you use when signing contracts. Your speech was not a rant. It was an audit. You listed facts, patterns, and outcomes, and each sentence closed a loophole Father liked to hide in. You made the room see that a prestigious title can coexist with cruelty, and that kindness plus discipline can produce a life that does not need anyone's approval stamp. After Father fled, a few people tried to scold you for being too direct, and you answered with a line that should be printed on every school wall. Protecting a violent man's reputation is not kindness. You refuse to confuse silence with virtue. That refusal has guided me in my own work whenever someone asks me to tolerate injustice for the sake of peace. In uniform, I've learned that strength is not the absence of fear. It is the ability to act while fear complains in the background. That lesson didn't come from drills first. It came from you. I saw you walk into meetings with your voice steady while your hands were cold. And I saw you keep promises even when nobody was watching. Sometimes I imagine the alternate life Father wanted. A household arranged around one shining child and one invisible one. In that version, I would have learned to disappear politely, and you would have learned to swallow pain with a smile. You rejected that script. You chose a harder plot, and the reward was not only money or status. It was breathing room. I'm writing all this, Mom, because I don't want our story reduced to gossip about IQ tests and divorces. The real thread is simpler. You protected a child from being discarded. You built a new structure from the rubble, and you taught that child to walk forward without begging to be considered worthy. If I sound certain now, it's because your persistence taught me that a future can be manufactured in small, unglamorous steps. If you read this after a long day, I hope you let the words land without immediately turning them into a task list. You don't have to prove anything to anyone anymore. The evidence is already living. In the company you built, in the daughter who serves with pride, and in the quiet fact that you are no longer trapped in a man's superstition about what a valuable child should be. I remember the first winter in the new city, when the heater rattled like it was arguing with the cold. You wrapped me in 2 sweaters and pretended it was an adventure, calling the living room our camp, and you made hot ginger tea so the steam could warm my face. You were teaching me, gently, that comfort can be improvised, and that a small room can still be a safe world. On weekends you took me to the public library, not because the place was glamorous, but because it offered silence without charging admission. You showed me how to choose books that fit my level without shame, and you said reading is not a race, it is a ladder. You climb one rung at a time. When I struggled, you never announced it to others, and that privacy felt like respect. Father's helplessness inside domestic life used to confuse me. He could lecture about theory for hours, yet he couldn't find the soy sauce even when it was in plain sight. He could argue about ethics on a stage and then forget to lock the door at night. Watching that contradiction made me distrust surface brilliance and start paying attention to what people do when nobody applauds. He also loved being fooled, because it allowed him to blame the world for not recognizing his good intentions. When scammers took his money, he came home furious and claimed you should have prevented it, as if your duty included managing his ego. You refused to become his shield, and that refusal was the beginning of your freedom. During the divorce, your phone never stopped buzzing. Relatives called to plead, threaten, or mediate, and every call carried the same message: return to the role that makes everyone else comfortable. You listened just long enough to understand the angle, then ended the call with firm politeness. I learned from that rhythm that boundaries can be enforced without theatrics. There were days you came home so tired you sat on the floor before you even took off your shoes. You would breathe for a minute, then stand up and cook anyway, not because you enjoyed suffering, but because you refused to let chaos decide our schedule. That discipline became the invisible scaffolding of my childhood. When my teacher once suggested I might need special education, you didn't explode. You asked what methods had been tried, what evidence existed, what the school's responsibility was. The teacher's confidence evaporated under your questions, and I watched you protect me without calling me fragile. You never asked the world to pity me. You asked it to do its job. I grew obsessed with being useful, which is a common wound for kids who sense they are considered a burden. I washed dishes aggressively, cleaned the table twice, and tried to anticipate your needs. You noticed and told me to stop apologizing with labor. You said a child's job is to grow, and an adult's job is to make growth possible. Quinn once told me, half joking, that your calm was CEO aura, and I almost laughed because he didn't know where it came from. That calm was forged in arguments at midnight, in bills that didn't match the money in your wallet, in moments where panic would have been understandable but useless. Success didn't create your steadiness. It revealed it. When the company started hiring, you insisted on paying on time, even if it meant you took less for yourself. You said late salaries create desperate people, and desperate people make mistakes. That was management, yes. But it was also morality expressed through payroll. You built a workplace that refused to repeat the cruelty of insecurity. I remember meeting one of your early employees who said she took the job because you listened to her as if she mattered. She had worked for bosses who praised loudly but exploited quietly. She said you were different because your promises matched your receipts. Hearing that made me proud in a way grades never did. Vivian's life, from the outside, looked like a string of golden beads. Awards, honors, applause. Yet when she visited once, she stared at my simple desk and asked why I wasn't trying harder to be better. I wanted to argue, but I realized she wasn't asking about me. She was repeating the only language Father had taught her. You answered for me by saying, calmly, that a person is not a resume. Later, when Vivian's mind began to unravel, I stopped wishing she would suddenly become kind and started wishing she would become free. Freedom would have forced her to face pain, but it would have given her a chance to choose herself instead of performing for Father. I don't know if she ever reached that place, but I know your hands were the first to offer her medical help instead of moral lectures. The family's obsession with smart blood always sounded ridiculous to me once I saw how much actual intelligence lives in ordinary survival. You understood contracts, schedules, customer psychology, and negotiation, and none of that came from Father's clan. If genes were destiny, you wouldn't have had to fight so hard against their superstition. The superstition itself proves how insecure they were. When I started training seriously, you adjusted your own schedule, so you could drive me to the track before sunrise. You didn't act like it was a sacrifice. You acted like it was logistics, because logistics makes love easier to carry. On those mornings, the streetlights were still on, and your car smelled faintly of coffee and determination. The Academy's rejection letter, with its wrong medical label, reminded me of childhood rumors, a careless line that people treat as truth because it is printed. You taught me to respect paperwork while refusing to worship it. We checked the data, demanded the original measurement, and made the system correct itself. After I was accepted, you refused to buy flashy fireworks. Instead, you bought practical gifts, better running shoes, a sturdier bag, a notebook for routines. You said celebration should make tomorrow easier, not just make tonight louder. That practicality is the kind of tenderness that lasts. At the banquet, I saw old classmates watching you with surprise, as if they had assumed a divorced woman must remain small forever. I heard them whisper about your company's revenue, but I knew the more shocking fact was not money. It was your refusal to be ashamed. You didn't become respectable by marrying again. You became unignorable by building. When you finally called Father out in public, I felt my stomach twist because part of me still feared his authority, even after everything. But your voice didn't shake. You spoke as if you were reading a report, and each fact landed like a stamp. In that moment, the power dynamic flipped, and I realized authority can be revoked. In my unit now, we use checklists, procedures, and after-action reviews to prevent mistakes. Those tools feel familiar, because you used your own version at home. Lists on the fridge, receipts in envelopes, notes about which teacher to call and which deadline mattered. You had been running operations long before anyone saluted you. Sometimes I think my ordinariness saved me, because I wasn't praised as a miracle. I learned to rely on effort instead of identity. I learned to accept correction without humiliation. I learned to measure myself by process. In a strange way, Father's contempt freed me from the addiction of approval. I used to worry that my childhood made me too harsh, too ready to fight. You softened that edge by modeling a different kind of strength. Steady, procedural, and compassionate. You never confused forgiveness with reunion. You showed me that you can wish someone well from a safe distance. Now, when I visit you, I notice the calm you've earned. Not the forced calm of endurance, but the real calm of stability. Your home has a rhythm that doesn't flinch at the sound of a phone call. Your laughter doesn't scan the room for permission. I'm grateful we reached this stage, even if the path here was ugly. If you ever doubt what you did, remember the simple outcomes. I am alive. I am employed. I am trusted by people who rely on me. I am not terrified of being not enough. These are not accidents. They are the compounded interest of your decisions, paid out in the only currency that matters, a life that can stand up straight. So keep this letter, Mom, not as a trophy, but as a mirror. On days when fatigue tries to rewrite your memory and tell you you merely got lucky, read these words and recall the work behind the luck. You built a rescue boat while the storm was still happening, and you rowed with bleeding hands until the shoreline appeared. I saw it. I remember it. If I sound intense, it's because honesty is intense when a family has spent years pretending. I don't need Father's apology anymore, and I don't need Vivian's recognition to feel real. What I need is for you to know that the child you refused to discard grew into someone who can carry other people to safety. That is the chain of cause and effect I am proud of. There were tiny moments when you let the mask slip, and those are the moments I treasure. Once, after a long day, you sat at the kitchen table and admitted you missed Vivian's childhood smell, the way a toddler's hair carries sweetness. You didn't blame her out loud. You blamed the system that turned a child into a badge. Then you rinsed the rice and returned to the present, because grief still has to eat. I also remember how you dealt with gossip in the new neighborhood. You never chased every rumor like a dog chasing stones. You acted normal, greeted people politely, paid bills on time, and let consistency do the persuading. Slowly, the whispers lost energy, because a stable life is boring to people who prefer drama. When I first received a small stipend, I offered to send it all to you, and you refused more than you accepted. You said I needed to learn financial discipline early so I would never be trapped by desperation. In that refusal, I heard the long-term thinking that made your company possible. You were always building tomorrow, not only surviving today. In quiet conversations, you taught me to choose partners carefully, not by their charm but by their behavior under stress. You said a man who cannot tolerate another person's weakness will eventually punish it. You said love should make you safer, not smaller. Those sentences sit in my mind like guardrails. Sometimes, after training, I watch new recruits panic when they make a mistake, and I recognize the fear behind their eyes. I tell them mistakes are data, not doom, and I realize I'm repeating your teaching with different vocabulary. That's how parenting travels. It becomes a voice in someone else's crisis. If you ever wonder whether leaving was worth the cost, measure the cost against the alternative. The alternative was a household where children were evaluated like products, and where your mind existed only as support staff for a man's pride. You escaped that fate, and by escaping, you gave me a blueprint for refusing bad deals, even when the deal comes labeled family. I'm ending here, Mom, because letters must stop somewhere even if gratitude doesn't. Save these words for the days when you feel lonely in your success, when you suspect nobody understands what it took. Your daughter understands. Your daughter is writing it down so memory cannot be edited by anyone else.